They stormed into my backyard like they owned the place. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, and voices dripping with arrogance. The HOA board had one mission: shut down my family barbecue. But what they didn't know was that they were about to get burnt. It all started on a sunny Saturday afternoon. The kind of day where the sky was so clear it looked like it had been painted with the brightest shade of blue, not a single cloud daring to interrupt its perfection. The air was warm but not overwhelming, just the right balance of sunshine and breeze. It was the kind of afternoon where happiness seemed inevitable, where even the trees swayed gently like they knew it was a day meant for celebration. The smell of grilled burgers drifted lazily through the neighborhood, carried by the wind like an unspoken invitation. You could hear the crackle of meat hitting the hot grill, that sizzle that instantly makes your mouth water. Along with it came the sound of laughter, kids chasing each other across the yard, shoes stomping through grass, shrieks of joy echoing like a soundtrack to the perfect family gathering. On the patio, music played just loud enough to set the vibe. Old classics, upbeat tracks everyone knew the words to. My uncle sang along off-key, and my aunt shook her head with a smile, pretending to be annoyed but clearly enjoying it. My grandmother sat in her favorite chair, fanning herself with a paper plate, while my dad stood proudly by the grill like a king at his throne, flipping burgers and ribs with exaggerated flair. The cousins had already claimed the swing set in the corner, turning it into some sort of pirate ship. Even neighbors we hadn't officially invited wandered in, drawn by the laughter and the smell of food. And honestly, that was fine. That's what these gatherings were about: community, family, and making memories. We weren't doing anything out of the ordinary, just a simple barbecue in my own backyard. But in HOA land, joy is apparently a crime. Now, let me paint a bigger picture. Our neighborhood was one of those planned communities, the kind developers brag about in brochures. Wide sidewalks, neatly trimmed hedges, mailboxes all lined up in perfect rows. On the surface, it looked idyllic. But underneath, there was an invisible force lurking: the HOA. For those lucky enough not to know, an HOA, or Homeowners Association, is supposed to maintain order and beauty. But more often than not, it turns into a power trip playground for people who crave control over the most ridiculous things. Grass an inch too high? Fine. Trash bins visible for 5 minutes too long? Warning letter. A wreath on your door in the wrong color scheme? Oh, that's a violation too. And on this perfect Saturday, they decided to target us. Before the storm hit, though, let me tell you, my family was in their element. Plates were piled high with potato salad, corn on the cob, baked beans, and burgers so juicy the buns couldn't hold them together. Kids' faces were covered in ketchup and chocolate from the dessert table my mom had set up. We told stories, old ones we'd heard 100 times, but still laughed at like it was the first. My cousin nearly dropped his soda when my uncle made one of his over-the-top jokes. My dad's best friend, who had come over with his guitar, started strumming a few songs, and soon everyone was singing. It wasn't just food and music. It was a reminder of why family gatherings matter. In those moments, you forget about bills, work stress, and the little things that weigh you down. For a few hours, life feels simple. It feels good. Of course, not everyone saw it that way. Across the street, from behind their perfectly trimmed rose bushes, I noticed a pair of disapproving eyes. Karen, every neighborhood has one. Ours just happened to also be on the HOA board. She stood there with her arms crossed, lips pursed so tightly it looked like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. I tried to ignore it. After all, how could anyone possibly object to a family barbecue? But if I've learned anything about Karens, it's this: the happier you are, the angrier they get. Sure enough, a few minutes later, she disappeared into her house. And when she came back, she wasn't alone. 2 other board members followed her, clipboards in hand, walking with the stiff determination of people who were about to ruin someone's day. They marched right into my backyard without knocking, without even saying hello. The laughter died down as soon as people realized what was happening. My uncle froze mid-bite, a rib halfway to his mouth. The kids stopped their pirate game and clung to their parents. Even the dog tilted his head like he knew something was wrong. Karen spoke first, her voice sharp and rehearsed. This gathering is in violation of HOA guidelines. No open flames, no outdoor parties exceeding 5 guests, and absolutely no amplified music." Her words sliced through the joy like a knife. For a moment, no one spoke. It was surreal. Here we were, in our own backyard, celebrating with family, and suddenly we were being treated like criminals. My dad, still holding the tongs, looked confused. "This is my house. My property. What are you talking about?" Karen flipped through her clipboard, like it was the Constitution itself. Page 47. Section 3B. HOA residents are prohibited from hosting disruptive gatherings that may disturb the peace of the community. Disruptive? The only thing disrupting the peace was her voice. My grandmother, usually the calmest woman you'll ever meet, whispered under her breath, "Over my dead body." The HOA members stood there, smug, expecting us to pack up, turn off the grill, and send everyone home. But instead of obeying, my family exchanged looks. Looks that said, "Are they serious?" And no way we're backing down. The kids started chanting barbecue. 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 Like it was a battle cry. My uncle raised his rib in defiance, like it was a torch at a rally. Even the dog barked as if he was on our side. Karen's face turned redder by the second. She didn't expect resistance. She expected compliance. But she was about to learn that this family didn't scare easily. You see, this wasn't just about burgers and music anymore. This was about principle, about freedom, about standing up to people who misuse power for their own satisfaction. The HOA thought they could dictate every aspect of our lives, how our grass looked, what color our fence was, even whether or not we could celebrate with our own families. But there's a line, and on that Saturday, they crossed it. Because when you try to take joy away from people, that's when you ignite something far more powerful than a grill. You ignite resistance. And so, what started as a sunny afternoon of burgers, laughter, and music was about to turn into something else entirely. A showdown between ordinary people who just wanted to live their lives, and a board of self-appointed rulers who believed they were untouchable. The burgers were still sizzling, the kids were still restless, and the music was still humming in the background. But now, everyone's eyes were locked on Karen and her clipboard army. It was no longer just a barbecue. It was a battle. And trust me, the HOA had no idea how badly they were about to get burned. Just as the ribs were hitting peak perfection, when the smoky aroma danced in the air and every stomach around the grill was growling in anticipation, it happened. 3 figures appeared at the edge of the yard. They weren't guests. They weren't neighbors coming to join the fun. No, these were the people everyone in the neighborhood secretly dreaded, the HOA board members. And in that moment, they didn't look like friendly community volunteers. They marched in like an army of fun police, clipboards clutched in their hands like weapons, sunglasses perched on their noses as if the sun itself had appointed them to this mission. At the front of the trio was the ringleader. Let's call her Karen with a K. You know the type. Haircut sharp enough to slice through steel, lips curled in permanent disapproval, and an attitude that screamed, "I was born to ruin your day." She didn't waste time with greetings. Instead, she barked out in a voice so shrill it cut through the music, and laughter like a siren. This gathering violates HOA regulations. No open flames, no loud gatherings, and absolutely no music above conversation level. The effect was instant. It was like someone had pressed pause on life itself. Everyone froze in place. My uncle, mid-bite, stood there holding a rib like it was evidence in a courtroom. My cousin, who had just raised a soda can to his lips, stopped so suddenly you could see the condensation dripping down his hand. Even the dog, who had somehow managed to snatch a sausage from the picnic table, stood motionless, with it dangling from his jaws, eyes wide as if even he understood the gravity of the moment. The music kept playing, but softer now, like even the speaker was afraid of Karen. The song that had been fueling our laughter suddenly sounded like background music in a horror film. I glanced around. Faces showed shock, confusion, and then irritation. This was our backyard, our family gathering, and these intruders had just barged in uninvited, armed with rules that felt like they'd been invented for the sole purpose of killing joy. I tried to stay calm, even though my blood was boiling. With a steady voice, I asked, "On what grounds can you shut down a family barbecue in my private yard?" Karen smirked. And that smirk, oh, that smirk, was the kind that people practice in the mirror before job interviews. The kind that says, "I've already won, and you're about to regret asking me anything." She raised her clipboard, like a judge about to hand down a sentence. "Page 47 of the HOA handbook. And if you don't comply, we'll fine you $500. The crowd reacted instantly. My grandmother gasped so loudly you'd think she'd just witnessed a crime. $500? For cooking ribs," she muttered, fanning herself with her paper plate, like the news had physically raised her blood pressure. My dad dropped his tongs onto the grill with a loud clang. $500? That's robbery, he boomed, pointing at the ribs sizzling innocently on the grate, as though they were now the most expensive cuts of meat in existence. The cousins started whispering in disbelief. $500? That's like a PS5 and 2 games. One said, "That's like my entire allowance for the year." Another muttered. Even the dog seemed to whine softly, like he understood the financial injustice at stake. Karen didn't blink. She loved the reaction. Her eyes glittered with the thrill of power, like a villain in the middle of their favorite scene. Behind her, the two other board members nodded solemnly, as if they were judges in some absurd talent show where happiness itself was forbidden. One of them even pulled out a pen like they were about to start writing up the ticket right there in the grass. Karen continued, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "Regulations are regulations. You signed the agreement when you moved into this community. And if you can't follow the rules, maybe you shouldn't be here." The way she said it made my skin crawl. She wasn't just talking about the barbecue. She was questioning whether my family belonged here at all. But here's the thing about my family. We don't back down easily. My uncle, rib still in hand, raised it like a microphone. "Let me get this straight. You're saying this rib, this perfectly seasoned, slow-cooked, fall-off-the-bone rib, is worth a $500 fine." He took a dramatic bite, chewed slowly, and then grinned. "Worth it." Laughter erupted around the yard, though nervous, because the tension was still there. My mom crossed her arms and stepped forward. "This is private property. You don't get to storm into our yard and boss us around like we're in kindergarten. My kids are playing. My husband is grilling. This is called living, Karen." One of the neighbors who had wandered and chimed in. "Since when is laughter illegal? Since when is food a crime?" The tide was starting to shift, and Karen didn't like it. Her smirk faltered for a second, but she quickly recovered. She jabbed her finger at the grill. "Open flame. That's a violation. That's a fire hazard." She turned to the speaker. "Amplified music. Violation." She scanned the crowd. Too many guests. Another violation. It was like she had a checklist of joy, and she was systematically marking off each offense. She tapped her clipboard dramatically. "You're racking up violations fast. By my count, you're already looking at over $1,000 in fines." The audacity left everyone stunned. It was as if she was deliberately trying to escalate the situation, feeding off the discomfort and fear she thought she was creating. But fear wasn't what she got. Anger was. My dad's face turned red, and his voice thundered louder than the music. "You can't just make up rules as you go. This is harassment." The cousins started chanting, "Barbecue! Barbecue! Barbecue!" louder and louder, their voices carrying across the neighborhood like a rallying cry. Some of the neighbors on nearby porches even clapped in support, clearly enjoying the drama and rooting for the underdogs. My grandmother, bless her heart, muttered something about tyranny and an American nonsense, which made half the adults stifle laughter. Even the dog barked 3 times in rhythm with the chants, like he'd chosen a side. So there we stood, the family and neighbors on one side, ribs and laughter fueling our defiance, and the HOA board on the other, clipboards raised like shields, rules and fines their only weapons. Karen's smug confidence wavered ever so slightly as she realized we weren't folding, but she still clung to her last ounce of authority. "This is your final warning," she hissed. "Comply, or face consequences." I looked her dead in the eye, a calmness washing over me. "No, this is your final warning, because we're not shutting down this barbecue. And if you think a couple of pages from a handbook gives you the right to storm into my yard and threaten my family, you're about to find out just how wrong you are. For a heartbeat, everything was quiet. The kids stopped chanting. The music hummed in the background. Even the grill seemed to sizzle more softly, waiting for the next move. It wasn't just about ribs anymore. It wasn't about music or gatherings. It was about freedom, about standing up to the petty tyrants who thought they could dictate every detail of our lives. And in that silence, with every eye locked on us, one thing was crystal clear. This wasn't going to end with a fine. It was going to end with the HOA getting burned. My family wasn't having it. Now, you have to understand, this is a family that avoids drama at all costs. Thanksgiving arguments? We laugh them off. Birthday disagreements? Settled with cake. Even the year my uncle set fire to the turkey fryer, nobody yelled. We just grabbed marshmallows and turned it into dessert. That's how non-confrontational we usually are. But this was different. When Karen and her clipboard brigade tried to kill our barbecue, something inside the family snapped. The first crack in the silence came from my grandmother, the sweetest, softest-spoken woman you'll ever meet, the kind of person who apologizes when you bump into her. She sat in her lawn chair, a floral sun hat shading her face, holding a plate stacked with potato salad and cornbread. For most of the confrontation, she had stayed quiet, watching with her calm, grandmotherly gaze. But when Karen uttered the words, $500 fine, something inside her flipped. She leaned forward, her fork trembling slightly, and muttered, $500 for eating burgers? Over my dead body. The entire yard froze again, but this time not in fear. In awe. Because when Grandma speaks like that, you know it's serious. This was the same woman who once haggled a car salesman into tears. The same woman who convinced the electric company to waive a 3-month bill after a power outage. If she was drawing a line in the sand, you better believe no one was crossing it. As if on cue, the kids, who had been watching with wide eyes, decided this was their moment. At first, it was just one small voice, barbecue, barbecue, barbecue. Then another joined, and another, and suddenly, the whole group of cousins, nieces, nephews, and even a few neighborhood kids were stomping their feet and clapping their hands, chanting in unison, barbecue, barbecue, barbecue. It echoed through the backyard like a battle cry. Plates rattled on the tables, soda cans vibrated, and even the inflatable kiddie pool rippled with each stomp. Karen's face turned the color of a ripe tomato. She snapped her fingers, trying to talk over them, but the chants only grew louder. The kids had found their power, and for once, the adults weren't stopping them. Meanwhile, my dad had transformed into something else entirely. Normally, he's the Dad Joe King, the guy who wears socks with sandals and takes naps in lawn chairs. But in that moment, he looked like a general preparing for war. Still gripping his stainless steel tongs, he stepped closer to the grill, planting his feet firmly on the ground as if the grill were his fortress. The flames flared dramatically, reflecting off his sunglasses. To me, it almost looked cinematic. The way the smoke curled around him, the way he gripped the tongs like a sword. He wasn't just protecting burgers. He was defending the very principle of family, freedom, and the sacred right to grill on a Saturday afternoon. Karen shouted something about safety violations, but my dad didn't flinch. Instead, he flipped a rack of ribs with a flourish so bold it felt like a challenge. That was when my cousin, clearly inspired by the growing rebellion, reached over to the Bluetooth speaker. With a sly grin, he cranked the volume knob to the max. Suddenly, the soft background music transformed into a full-blown concert. The bass thumped so hard the plastic cups on the picnic table rattled. People cheered. The chants of barbecue, barbecue, merged with the beat until the whole yard felt like a festival. And just like that, the mood shifted. Fear was gone. Laughter returned. We weren't just hosting a barbecue anymore. We were staging a revolution. Karen was losing control, and everyone could see it. Her clipboard trembled in her hands. Her jaw clenched so tightly it looked painful. "You're making this worse for yourselves," she screeched, but no one listened. The kids stomped harder. The music blasted louder. The dog even joined in, barking along with the chants. Her two backup board members exchanged nervous glances. One of them quietly lowered his clipboard, clearly regretting ever leaving his house that day. The other muttered something about needing to consult the bylaws and stepped back. But Karen? Oh, she doubled down. She stormed toward the grill, pointing at my dad like she was about to banish him from the kingdom. "That grill is coming down right now," she barked. Before my dad could respond, my uncle stepped forward, rib still in hand. "Lady, this rib has more backbone than your entire HOA." He took a dramatic bite, sauce dripping down his chin, and everyone burst out laughing. My mom, usually the peacemaker, shook her head and raised her voice. "Enough. You don't get to dictate what happens in our backyard. You can shove your handbook right back into whatever drawer of misery it came from." Even Grandma chimed in again, this time louder. "If you so much as touch that grill, you'll be answering to me." The crowd erupted in cheers. Neighbors leaning over fences started clapping. A few even walked over and joined the barbecue, emboldened by the chaos. It was no longer just our family against the HOA. It was the entire neighborhood against tyranny. Karen tried one last desperate tactic. She whipped out her phone and started dialing. "Fine. If you won't comply, I'll call security. I'll call the police. I'll call." But she didn't finish. Because right then, my cousin switched the song to something so perfectly defiant, so undeniably fitting, that even the neighbors started laughing. It was one of those iconic anthems everyone knows, the kind that makes you want to raise your hands and sing at the top of your lungs. Within seconds, the entire backyard was singing along, drowning out Karen's threats. My dad raised his tongs like a conductor leading an orchestra, and the chants of barbecue, blended seamlessly with the music. Looking back, it wasn't just funny, it was symbolic. This wasn't really about ribs, burgers, or music. It was about ordinary people refusing to be bullied by people who thought a clipboard gave them absolute power. It was about standing together, about unity, about saying, "No, you don't get to kill joy just because it doesn't fit into your narrow rulebook." That's why the kids chanted. That's why my dad stood guard. That's why even Grandma, the gentlest soul among us, drew her line. Because sometimes the smallest moments, like defending a Saturday barbecue, become the biggest battles for dignity. Finally, realizing she'd lost control, Karen's voice cracked. This isn't over," she screeched, backing toward the gate. But it was over, and everyone knew it. The crowd was united, the music was booming, and the grill was hotter than ever. She had no authority left, no fear to feed on. She stomped off in a fury, her clipboard shaking, her backup trailing awkwardly behind like defeated soldiers retreating from a battlefield. As the gate slammed shut, the crowd erupted in cheers so loud they drowned out even the music. People hugged. Kids danced. My dad flipped another burger with victory in his eyes. And my grandmother? She calmly took another bite of cornbread and said, "Now that's how you deal with nonsense." From that moment on, the barbecue turned legendary. Neighbors brought over extra food and drinks. Someone set up sparklers for the kids. The music stayed loud, the laughter stayed louder, and the grill never once stopped. It wasn't just a meal anymore. It was a celebration of freedom, a declaration that joy is not a violation, and that no HOA, no matter how smug, could take that away. As I stood there, watching my family laugh, sing, and eat like nothing could stop them, I realized. The HOA thought we'd roll over. Instead, we turned up the music. And in that moment, victory had never tasted so sweet. Karen absolutely lost it. You could see the steam practically blowing out of her ears. She clutched that HOA handbook like it was some kind of holy scripture, flipping through the pages with shaking fingers, trying to find every possible rule she could throw at us. Her voice was shrill, cracking at the edges as she shouted about order, rules, and community standards. But here's the thing. Nobody was taking her seriously anymore. At first, her threats sounded intimidating. "We'll fine you $500 per violation. We'll revoke your community privileges. We'll call in security." But as she went on, the whole scene turned less like a confrontation and more like a comedy show. And it didn't help her case when she actually whipped out her phone and dialed the HOA president. with her hand on her hip and the other pointing at my grill like it was a weapon of mass destruction. She barked into the phone. "Mr. President, we have a code red. Unauthorized charcoal grilling, noise disturbances, and yes, more than 5 unauthorized guests." I swear, if you close your eyes, you would have thought she was reporting a bank robbery, not a family barbecue. By this point, my cousins were hiding their laughter behind paper plates. My uncle was sipping his soda like it was a front-row ticket to the best drama of the year, and my dad was still standing guard over the grill with those tongs, like a knight sworn to protect the kingdom of ribs. And then came the big escalation. Karen called for backup. She told us, "Security will be here in minutes." Like we were some kind of criminal cartel cooking illegal meat in the backyard. The whole family looked at each other and burst out laughing. Even my grandmother, who rarely ever raised her voice, shook her head and said, "Lord help this woman." But here's where things got really interesting. While Karen was busy dialing up a little army of fun police, something unexpected started happening. One by one, neighbors from the surrounding houses began poking their heads over fences, drawn by the noise and curiosity. Some were holding coffee mugs, others just folding their arms and watching the chaos unfold like it was Saturday entertainment. And then it clicked. This wasn't just our barbecue anymore. This had turned into something bigger. Our neighbors weren't annoyed by the music or the smell of ribs. In fact, some started sniffing the air like cartoon characters, floating toward the scent of pie. The smell of grilled chicken and corn on the cob drifted through the neighborhood like an invitation nobody wanted to miss. Within minutes, 2 neighbors came over with chairs. Another brought a bowl of chips. Somebody shouted, "Need an extra cooler?" and disappeared into their garage. It was like a chain reaction. What started as a family barbecue suddenly became a block party, and all of it was in direct defiance of Karen and her rule book. Karen, though, wasn't giving up. She stood in the middle of our yard, waving her handbook like a magician's wand, yelling out absurd regulations, one after the other. No cooking outside unless it's electric. No more than 5 guests at one time. No noise that can be heard from the sidewalk. The more she read, the worse it sounded. It wasn't a list of community guidelines. It was a survival manual for robots. Finally, one of my neighbors, a guy named Dave, couldn't take it anymore. He leaned over the fence, cupped his hands like a megaphone, and yelled, "So basically, we can't live like humans?" That was it. The whole backyard exploded in laughter. Even people who weren't eating or drinking just doubled over from the ridiculousness of it all. Karen's face turned the color of ketchup, and you could see the power slipping right out of her grip. Because here's the truth. Rules only work when people believe in them. And in that moment, not a single soul in sight believed Karen's nonsense. Up until then, Karen thought she held all the cards. She had the handbook. She had the HOA president on speed dial. She had security on the way. But suddenly, she was just one angry voice against an entire neighborhood that was fed up with being treated like children in their own homes. My dad turned the music up a notch, the kids started a conga line, and my cousin grabbed the mic and shouted, "Welcome to the Karen-Free Barbecue Bash 2025. The crowd cheered. For the first time, Karen realized she was outnumbered. Not by a few family members, but by an entire community that had been silently waiting for someone to finally stand up to the HOA's absurd control. And that's when you could see the fear in her eyes. Not fear of us, but fear of losing control. A golf cart rolled down the street a few minutes later. It was the so-called security Karen had called. 2 guys in polo shirts with radios clipped to their belts, looking more like mall cops than actual enforcers. They stopped at the end of the driveway, surveyed the scene, the grills, the laughter, the music, the growing crowd, and you could see the hesitation in their faces. Karen sprinted to them, flapping her handbook, yelling about violations and illegal gatherings. But the security guys didn't move. They just looked at each other, shrugged, and one of them said, "This just looks like a party." That was the final blow. The entire yard roared with laughter, and even the neighbors, who had been quietly watching, couldn't help but clap. Karen's backup had failed her. Her rulebook had failed her. Her power had failed her. In that moment, everything changed. The HOA wasn't this untouchable monster anymore. It was just a handful of people trying to control the uncontrollable life. The smell of food, the sound of laughter, the joy of being together with family and friends. That's not something you can regulate away. And deep down, everyone knew it. One by one, people started speaking up. A neighbor told Karen how ridiculous the no more than 5 guests rule was, since their family alone had 6 people. Another complained about the no outdoor cooking rule, saying it made them feel like prisoners. It was like the floodgates had opened, and all the bottled-up frustration people had with the HOA came pouring out. Karen, red-faced and trembling, realized she had lost the crowd. Her threats were meaningless now. The community wasn't afraid anymore. So she did the only thing left in her arsenal. She stomped her foot, pointed at us, and shouted, "This isn't over." And then she stormed off, handbook tucked under her arm, like a defeated general retreating from battle. The barbecue. It went on for hours. Neighbors stayed, food kept coming, and music carried into the night. But more importantly, something bigger had started that day. A rebellion against the absurd rules that had been suffocating us for years. Because it wasn't just about burgers anymore. It was about freedom. See, what the HOA didn't know was that I had done my homework. Most people never bother reading those thick HOA handbooks. They're boring, full of legal jargon, and feel like a bedtime story designed to put you to sleep. But me? I had sat down with a cup of coffee one evening a month earlier and read every single page, cover to cover. Why? Because I had a gut feeling the HOA would eventually try something sneaky. And boy, was I right. Buried deep in the middle of the document, hidden between paragraphs about lawn maintenance and parking restrictions, I found something powerful. A little clause the HOA never expected anyone to notice, let alone remember. It stated, any HOA rule that is not enforced consistently across all members cannot legally be applied selectively. In plain English, that meant if they let one neighbor get away with breaking a rule, they couldn't suddenly enforce it on me. The rule had to apply equally to everyone, or it didn't apply at all. And I knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that Karen and her cronies had broken their own rules. Just last week, Karen herself had hosted a birthday party. Not a quiet little tea gathering, no. I'm talking balloons tied to the fence, kids screaming on a bounce house, a DJ blasting 80s hits loud enough to rattle windows, and, oh, the best part, a barbecue grill fired up right in her backyard. She had done exactly what she was accusing me of doing. And guess what? I had receipts. I pulled out my phone, scrolled through my gallery, and landed on the golden treasure. Photos I had taken from my window during her big bash. There she was, front and center, holding a burger in one hand and a beer in the other. Behind her, a smoking grill loaded with hot dogs. Next to her, a DJ with giant speakers blasting music loud enough for the whole street to hear. The moment I turned my phone toward her, the whole crowd gasped. Karen's face drained of color. 1 second, she was standing tall like the queen of the HOA, and the next, she looked like a kid caught with her hand in the cookie jar. The look on her face? Absolutely priceless. I held my phone up for everyone to see, my voice calm but loud enough to carry across the yard. "Karen," I said, "you're quoting page 47 of the handbook right now, but you seem to have forgotten the part about consistent enforcement. Because here's you." I tapped the screen, enlarging the photo of her flipping burgers, breaking the exact same rules you're trying to fine me for. Her jaw dropped. She sputtered like a car engine refusing to start. That was different," she stammered. That was a private event." I raised an eyebrow. "Really? So a birthday party with a DJ and half the neighborhood wasn't a gathering? And those burgers you were grilling, were they electric? Because that looks a lot like charcoal to me." The crowd erupted with laughter. My family, my neighbors, even the so-called security, guys trying to look official. All of them couldn't hold it in. Some were practically doubled over, clutching their stomachs from laughing so hard. In that moment, the power dynamic flipped completely. Up until then, Karen and the HOA had been in control, waving their rulebook around like a weapon. But now, they were exposed as hypocrites. And nothing destroys authority faster than hypocrisy. The neighbors who had been on the fence, literally and figuratively, suddenly had no reason to stay quiet. "That's true," one neighbor shouted. "I was at Karen's party. It went until midnight." Another chimed in, "And the music was way louder than this barbecue." Someone else added, "Yeah, and I saw her grilling steaks. Not electric either." It was like a courtroom, and Karen was on trial. The jury? The entire neighborhood. The evidence? Right there on my phone. Karen's voice cracked as she tried to claw her way out of the hole she had dug. "This is irrelevant. I had permission from the HOA board." "Oh, really?" I shot back. "So you gave yourself permission to break the rules you're trying to fine me for? That sounds fair." The sarcasm wasn't lost on anyone. More laughter echoed through the yard, and the sound of people clapping drowned out her weak excuses. For the first time all afternoon, Karen looked small. The confidence, the smugness, the authority, it all vanished. She was just another neighbor caught in her own lie. And then, right on cue, the HOA president himself showed up. A tall man in a polo shirt, clipboard in hand, strutting down the driveway like he was about to restore order. He looked around at the crowd, then at me, then at Karen, who was practically sweating bullets. "What's going on here?" he demanded. Karen rushed over to him, like a child tattling to a parent. "They're breaking the rules. Open flames, too many guests, loud music." But before she could finish, I walked forward, calm as ever, phone in hand. "Actually," I said, "I think you'll want to see this first." And I showed him the photos. Karen's face, the grill, the DJ, the balloons, the whole scene of her massive birthday bash. The president froze. He looked from the phone, to Karen, to the crowd, and then back to Karen. "You hosted this?" he asked slowly. Karen's voice cracked. It wasn't like this. It was different." But it was too late. The damage was done. The neighbors exploded again, cheering, clapping, chanting. Some shouted things like "checkmate" and "rules for thee, not for me, huh, Karen?" Others just shook their heads in disbelief at how long the HOA had been pulling this double standard. One guy even shouted, "Looks like the HOA just got barbecued," which sent the entire crowd into hysterics. Karen buried her face in her hands. The president, clearly embarrassed, muttered something about needing to review the situation and speak with the board. But he knew. Everyone knew. They had no case. That was the exact second I knew we had won. Not just the barbecue, not just the day, but the bigger fight. Because when Karen realized she had no leg to stand on, when the president realized the HOA had been exposed as hypocrites, when the neighbors realized they finally had proof they weren't alone in being unfairly targeted, that was the moment the tide turned for good. And standing there, grill smoke rising behind me, music thumping in the background, my family and neighbors united in laughter and victory, I'll never forget the look on Karen's face. Priceless. Absolutely priceless. Suddenly, their entire argument crumbled. For hours, Karen and the president had clung to that rulebook like it was a shield, throwing regulation after regulation at us, convinced they could intimidate us into silence. But with one swipe of my phone, one set of photos exposing their hypocrisy, the shield shattered. The crowd's reaction was immediate. Neighbors erupted into applause, cheering, whistling, some even stomping their feet against the ground like they were at a concert. Kids laughed, parents shouted encouragement, and a few people whipped out their phones to capture the HOA's meltdown on camera. And let me tell you, the cameras didn't miss a thing. There was Karen, trembling and pale, caught mid-sputter. There was the president, eyes darting around, suddenly realizing he'd lost the room. And there was the sea of neighbors, no longer fearful of fines or violations, but united in laughter, joy, and pure defiance. The HOA president muttered something under his breath about reviewing the bylaws and further discussion at the next meeting. His once confident voice was now shaky, weak, desperate. He tried to quietly step back, as if melting into the crowd might erase his humiliation. But the people weren't about to let them off the hook. Shouts rang out from every direction. Hypocrites. Double standards. Let us live. Each chant grew louder, fueling the energy in the yard. It wasn't anger, it was power. It was relief. For the first time in years, the neighbors realized the HOA wasn't invincible. They weren't kings and queens ruling the neighborhood. They were just people, flawed, hypocritical, and suddenly exposed for everyone to see. The president glanced at Karen, who stood frozen like a statue. Her eyes were locked on the ground, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The smug smirk she always carried had evaporated. She looked smaller than ever before. What happened next was something none of us expected. The barbecue, which had started as a simple family gathering, had transformed into a community rally. Neighbors didn't just cheer, they started organizing, right there in the backyard. "Let's file a petition," someone shouted. "Yeah, force them to change the rules," another agreed. Phones came out, not just to record, but to connect. People swapped numbers, formed group chats, and began talking openly about all the times they'd been unfairly fined or harassed by the HOA. Stories spilled out. One family fined $100 for having too many flower pots on their porch. Another threatened because their kid's bike was left on the lawn for an afternoon. A widow shamed for repainting her shutters without official approval. The more stories people shared, the more frustrated they became, and the more determined they were to fight back. By the time the sun started to set, it wasn't just a barbecue anymore. It was a movement. People had gone from quietly tolerating the HOA's nonsense to openly challenging it. And it wasn't just talk. They were signing digital petitions, drafting letters, and setting dates for meetings to demand change. Within days, those sparks turned into a firestorm. Complaints poured into the HOA office. Emails flooded their inbox. Hand-signed petitions circulated from door to door. Social media lit up with videos of Karen's meltdown, each clip more embarrassing than the last. The whole neighborhood had seen enough, and now they were united. The HOA had no choice but to respond. Under pressure, the board announced an emergency review of the bylaws. They framed it like they were doing it voluntarily, but everyone knew the truth. They were backed into a corner. Neighbors showed up to the meeting in record numbers, their voices louder and stronger than the board had ever expected. People demanded answers, waving petitions in the air, quoting bylaws back at the board with the same energy Karen once used to terrorize others. The hypocrisy couldn't be denied. How could they enforce no BBQs when half the board had hosted BBQs themselves? How could they fine families for gatherings when their own events broke every noise rule in the book? The rules weren't just unfair, they were a joke. And in the end, the board had to admit it. The fallout was brutal for the HOA leadership. Karen was the first to crack. She resigned from the board, citing personal reasons. Though everyone knew the real reason, she couldn't show her face without hearing whispers of Burger Karen or rule-breaking Karen. But she wasn't the only one. 2 other board members followed, and even the president eventually stepped down after weeks of relentless pressure. For the first time in years, the HOA's iron grip on the neighborhood was broken. With new leadership voted in, everything changed. The ridiculous rules were rewritten. Families could finally have BBQs without fearing fines. Kids could play outside without their laughter being labeled a noise violation. People decorated their homes with pride, not fear of non-approved colors. The neighborhood came alive again. And the best part, everyone remembered where it started, right there, in my backyard, with one barbecue that refused to be shut down. Sometimes, victory isn't about winning a court case or writing a check. Sometimes it's about standing your ground in the face of nonsense and proving that when people come together, even the most controlling bullies can't hold power forever. That barbecue started as just another Saturday. Burgers, ribs, music, laughter. But it ended as a turning point for the entire community. We didn't just grill food that day, we grilled the HOA. And the taste of victory? Better than any burger I've ever had.